there's a whole generation behind us that we actually have a real responsibility to help bring them up.
You know, when I think about my relationship to design, I feel like I've broken up with design many times, and I probably will again at some point.
Hello, I'm Doug Powell. Welcome to Season 2 of This is a Prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast. In the last year, the design profession has continued to evolve in fascinating ways. The global economic conditions have forced many large U.S.-based tech companies to pull the plug on the design investment that had fueled exponential growth of design teams in previous years, with many companies conducting high-profile layoffs. At the same time, we're seeing startups and companies in tech-adjacent industries prioritizing design as a differentiator and business driver more than ever. Kate Aronowitz and Robert Fabricant, my guests in this special two-part season opening episode, help me make sense of these complex and sometimes contradictory signals. Kate Aronowitz is a design partner at Google Ventures, the investment arm of Google, where she works with startup founders and CEOs to envision and plan how design can fuel their companies. Before joining GV in 2017, Kate held leadership roles at LinkedIn, Wealthfront, and Facebook. Robert Fabricant is a partner at Dahlberg Design, where he leads global teams at the intersection of design and social impact. Robert is the co-author, along with Cliff Kwang, of the 2019 book User Friendly: How the Hidden Rules of Design Are Changing the Way We Live, Work, and Play. Robert also authored 2 recent articles for Fast Company analyzing the state of design leadership. In part 1 of this episode, we dig into Kate and Robert's design backstories, and we discuss the growth and expansion of design as a practice and a profession in the last 2 decades. Part 2 of the episode will post in your podcast feed early next week. We get into our discussion as Kate Aronowitz tells us how she discovered design.
I think it really started on the art side. I don't think I was all that aware of what design was. Loved to draw. My mom took me to lots of museums. I was very into fashion. My grandmother and I used to design dresses and make them together and all sorts of stuff up through high school. And that was a really fun way of connecting with her. So wanted to go to school for fashion design. My parents were not in favor of that. So I ended up at Syracuse. Told them I was going to study political science and did a little bit of fashion, but quickly realized that fashion was a hobby, not something I wanted to do for a living. Made my way down to the Savannah College of Art and Design, finally convinced my parents that art school was going to be okay. They had a computer lab on campus, and I thought, okay, I could probably make a living if I learned computers, and found graphic design. And to me, what I loved about that was it was an outlet for my visual urge and my artistic side, but it brought order to it, which I like. I like structure. I like order. I like putting things together. And so my career really just began in graphic design. On the agency side, very traditional logos, advertising. I think my first job, I was doing labels for vitamin bottles, very exciting. And then moved to California in late 2000, which was not a great time to be out here as a designer. We talk about cycles. It's a good time to be a designer, not a good time to be a designer, especially one that had never done web. And the only company at the time that was kind of hiring, eBay, was hiring designers. And I went down. I had no web experience, but they happened to be hiring a print designer to do sales material. And I was like, I need a job. I will take it. I commuted 3 hours each way, all the way from Marin down to San Jose. But that's really where the magic happened. At eBay, there's this guy, Marty Kagan, who you guys probably know, who's written some amazing books on product. He was there and heading up the product in what was kind of a new UX discipline. And I didn't really know what UX was. I was fascinated by this idea of like user research. They had content strategy, like a truly cross-functional design team back in 2000, which was very cool to me. And I basically just started hanging out with the team and taking up the projects they weren't interested in. But really again, bringing another layer to design from, fashion design to graphic design to now like human-centered design. That to me was magic. It was like actually bringing design to something that's useful in a business context. And that's really where the UX thing started for me. And then found myself in the place of kind of translation between the business team and the design team. We were always arguing and made my way into managing and running teams, and that kind of the rest is history. Happy to share more about that, but that's really where that was all galvanized for me.
Yeah, that's a great arc. I'm always intrigued by the role that our parents play in these stories. And you mentioned your parents were, skeptical and concerned. And this was, say a little bit more about, what you think they were thinking, their daughter going into having this interest in design, and what does that mean?
They both come from very traditional backgrounds. My mom was a vice president at a bank. My dad did PR and comms for a living in the financial industry. I don't think design was as popularized as it is now, right? You didn't have a phone in your pocket where you can say, all those things you're using right now, you're taking a voice recording, you're checking in with me, you're starting your car, you're doing all these things. Like that's something useful, and that design like really plays a role in that. So I think it took a while for me to even understand that that's the role that design can play, and then to kind of share it with them. But
we didn't have that reference point.
No, we didn't.
In those years. I mean, it's still a hard thing to explain, but at least we can pull the thing out of our pocket and say it's making things for this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Robert, how about you? Take us back and tell us your backstory.
Well, this is such an interesting exercise and a lot of parallels for sure. But when I think about my relationship to design, I feel like I've broken up with design many times, and I probably will again at some point. I think growing up in New York, probably a bit of a different generation than you, Kate, but nonetheless, I was lucky in that I got exposed to design as a creative kid, as a kid who's drawing and painting and doing all that stuff. I got exposed to design through a series of just lucky breaks when I was kind of in high school and college, and I got to intern at MoMA in their publications department and get a sense of design and production there. I worked for Martha Stewart at her publishing house for a little while. I worked at Sherman Geismar, so a really top-end kind of brand and identity firm. And, it didn't stick. Like I kept glancing off it. I wasn't finding my soul in any of that work. And when I got out of college, I worked in criminal justice advocacy and nonprofit work in New York and community organizing. And I was trying to approach all that work creatively. And I was learning a lot about people and their behavior. And I was learning a lot about the power of information and feedback to shape systems, legal systems, criminal justice systems. But it didn't, to me, it still seemed very disconnected to design. Through a few more twists and turns, I kind of found my way back. And what opened the door for me was this sense that these digital environments I was starting to work in as a creative person, as an artist, were kind of spaces that had this different structure and possibility and behavior to them. At first, I was just using these tools as I was doing my artwork on the side, while I was doing all that kind of advocacy work. And I started asking myself a question, which is, who does get to design these kind of systems and experiences? The different sides of my brain were kind of firing a bit. And I was lucky. I went to grad school at NYU at ITP, and I ended up out at Microsoft for a summer. And this is like early mid-90s. Worked for a very visionary person, Linda Stone, and my job was to spend the whole summer in these 3D virtual chat environments, very early environments, as well as mods and moves. These very social, imaginative spaces that existed online, but they were so like niche and filled with such strange people. And I just started to realize that there were social systems and behavior, and I'd studied anthropology in college. Like there was just a lot happening there. And so that's kind of what got me excited again, was thinking about design from that perspective. But I still was in an industry that wasn't really doing that. Again, I was ready to break up with it. I was not seeing that connection. We got very marketing centric, very agency centric. And as a kid who grew up in New York, like I've always felt that the agency world and the marketing world is just not where I want to plant my feet and not where I feel I belong. So I was just lucky. I was getting ready to break up with it, but this was 2001 when a lot of things were going wrong. And I ended up at Frog. And the first project I worked on, or one of them, was a biofeedback device. on heart rate variability. So it was a physical device that I was thinking through the interaction problems and how and what information would get somebody to adopt this device and use it, particularly in moments of high stress, because it was meant to be a stress management tool. It just was the first time that these things were coming together where I was thinking about all these different facets of people and their behavior. I was able to do the kind of user research to inform it. I was able to sort of think through the different facets of this product as an entry point into that behavioral problem. And I feel like everything I've done since is kind of iterations on that same loop. And then I kind of as that world of behavior and user experience got more and more adopted by business, and it was a lot more about, as you were saying, Kate, kind of what is that translation to business. I kind of broke up with design a bit again, and found a different world, which is the world I work in now, which is one around social impact, public sector work, international development work. And once again, had to kind of refactor all those ideas to very different audiences, very different cultures. And that's what's keeping me going now. I've been at that for 10 years and probably another 5 years maybe of that. And then I'm probably going to break up again and see what happens.
You're already planning your breakups. You've been through this cycle so many times now, right? Before we get too far along, Kate, tell us about Google Ventures, your role there, and what's the mission you're on with that program?
Sure. So Google Ventures is the early stage kind of investment arm of Google, and we're independent. We're not strategic. We're not looking to invest in technology for Google. And we invest across life sciences, so everything from drug development to MIDI, so electronic health delivery, to enterprise, deep security, and consumer, sneakers at StockX. And basically, we've been around about 15 years. And so there's the investing side of the house. But key to the founding of GV was also this belief that really terrific operators in-house could help companies at these kind of critical building points in where they are, whether it was finding a new audience, pivoting their product, hiring that right C-suite person. So I run that. So I joined as a design partner. So I wear two hats. Half of my time is spent working with founders, CEO, new heads of design, designers at startups that you can imagine you're a team of one, and you need a bit of advice. You need a second set of eyes on something, or you need to advocate better for design, or helping CEOs set up design from the very beginning to give them a warm welcome at their companies. So spend a lot of time with companies doing that, and then also just run this operating team that's constantly looking across the landscape and figuring out what are the services and people we can provide to the startups to help them really take advantage of the opportunity that they have in front of them.
You have a very unique job.
I consider myself incredibly lucky. The GV design team is the original design team in venture. They wrote the Sprint book. They kind of open sourced what they did. And I consider myself incredibly lucky. Like this is, I'm hoping, the last job. It's been 7 years. I work with like 30 to 40 companies a year. I've been given a platform to do a lot of community work. Doug, you've been part of some of the stuff that we've done here. Really, really lucky to be able to kind of look across, see the trends, and then also try to use my connections and my knowledge of what's going on in the broader context of design and bring those insights and those leaders into the startups as well.
Robert, fill out the picture a little bit more on Dahlberg, and you gave us a few notes on that a moment ago, but tell us about the big idea there, the mission you're on, the team that you have. How is it all coming together?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an evolving kind of journey, and a pretty big departure in the sense that I went from, working in kind of mainstream corporate product and service design and starting to sense that there were clearly a need, but also an appreciation and potentially a willingness to invest that was coming out of governments, out of large foundations like Gates and others, out of the public sector, and trying to kind of right size what's the right approach. Because the organizations we work with and deliver to don't have much design capacity or culture internally. They bring a tremendous human-centered view in most cases, and it can sometimes seem surprising, but even in government, if you talk to bureaucrats and people who are career government folks, like they are very much driven by trying to create outcomes at a population level, at least the best are, and similarly with the other social sector folks we work with. But somehow, I don't know exactly how to explain this, but But it feels like that whole sector lost its way a little bit in terms of, having a viewpoint on the sort of aspirations of how they're going to serve people, but not necessarily working in a space where they can meet people where they are, not working in a space where they're comfortable or have the tools to bring people to the table to co-create and prototype and get to what's going to work. And so you come in as a designer, and on the one hand, you're seen as if you've got four heads, like people don't exactly know why you're at the table and why you're in the room at the UN or someplace else. On the other hand, they start quickly ascribing to you a whole set of needs and hopes around that big, broad idea. Like, how do we bring people to the table? How do we understand their behavior? How do we make systems work for them? And the truth is, it takes many skills to do that, not just design. But for some reason, design has become the beacon for that sector of how they get back to that idea. And you have to run through so many hurdles and gates. I mean, I know you're nodding, Doug, because you've done this work a bit too. You run through so many hurdles and gates to make that idea a reality. And so part of the reason we and my partner, Ravi Chatpar, we embedded ourselves in a larger firm, Dahlberg, that runs through those gates all the time. And sometimes mans those gates in terms of, setting the investment priorities for large foundations, understanding and analyzing the core data that governments are using to make decisions. So we needed somebody to help us open those gates. I'm going to kill this metaphor, I'm sure, by the end of this. But, we wanted to be in a place where there were folks who could help us open those gates, where we could come in and reorient at least some part of the way these things were working around those human-centered values, but back that up with and bring the responsibility to it that comes with the precious resources that we work with. I mean, we are funded by public sector resources, so it's either taxpayers or philanthropy, some company. And so the time we spend talking to people, the time we spend working with people, we have to be very responsible for the data and the learning and the ideas and solutions and how those are going to make it to the market. And so, we found an environment where we felt we could do that. Along the way, and starting to do this work back at Frog, we met so many talented young people around the world. And particularly when you step into some of the cultures that we work in East Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, like for many of the young people we work with, it blows their mind to think that there is a profession and a career path around doing this kind of work, that it's a set of skills they can use, not just for fashion or interiors, but to rethink and improve the world and serve their communities. And so you meet these young people, and we had no home for them. So another big idea for us was at a small scale, and I think our theory of change, and Kate, I think your work to some degree bears this out, you don't need to necessarily fill the world with as many designers as you may have engineers or nurses or doctors or other things. And so we built these small communities of practice in Dakar, in Nairobi, in Mumbai, now in Mexico City. And we feel if we can scale up to 10, 15 designers in each of those places, we can have a massive effect. And so, that's the journey we're on. We want to do it sustainably. We want to be paid well to do the work because the world needs it, because it's a very specialized skill. And to build an organization that does it equitably and inclusively and grows and brings a diverse group into this work takes resources, lots of resources. So that's the journey we're on. And, we get a lot of head nods to the big idea, but making it work in practice it can be terrifying day to day.
Yeah. I see so many parallels here. Unexpected for me, and as you talk about essentially establishing a design startup in Mexico City, and how much that resembles what Kate is talking about in her role of, how do we get a small organization to get to the next level and to be sustainable and to have impact. Robert, I want to ask you about your wonderful book, User Friendly: How the Hidden Rules of Design Are Changing the Way We Live, Work, and Play, co-authored with Cliff Quang and published in 2019. What was the inspiration for that book, and what perhaps was the gap that you saw and that you thought this amazing book might fill?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I mean, a lot of the credit certainly for the quality of the results, goes to Cliff and his incredible kind of reporting and storytelling. But at the core of it, I think we approached it a little like a product, and we were lucky to find a publisher, in particular an editor in Sean McDonald, who saw it that way. And, he and I were collaborating a bit on telling some of the stories around how the reach of a certain kind of design, particularly user experience design, was refactoring not just the things that are in front of our faces, like the Googles and eBays of this world, but I was working with GE and thinking about infrastructure and transportation, like all the systems in our lives that were starting to change, and watching the disorientation of my family, my parents, as those changes would show up in little bits and bobs. I think for us, we felt that there was a literacy that was missing, that the few of us like you and me, Kate and Doug, it's pretty rare that I'm confronted with a new product, particularly one that has some embedded technology, whether it's the controller that's being installed right now in my basement to control my home heating system, or a new website, new app, things like that. Or I go out into the world and have to operate some kind of silly parking machine that requires logging into an app and then doing this and doing that. All of it feels like you kind of know the code, and each time you can kind of like pick the lock and figure out, like, partly because you think a little bit like the person who designed it, like, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing if I hit problems, or what did they intend? Anyway, there's a literacy there. So I think we were reaching a point where we felt like that literacy was really missing, and the best parallel I can provide is like in the 50s and 60s, when advertising and marketing became this transformative engine that changed so much about the physical environment, the culture, the consumer environment, all these things around us, right? And people were suddenly seeing these messages and being told stories about their lives and the products and the things they might use and consume. It took a while for people to get literate. But by the time I was in high school and college, and I think many people, like, there was a bit of a pedagogy. There were things you would tell your kids. Like, there were ways in which we learned how to interpret and read advertising and marketing and navigate it and understand it. And it was very hard to be in our society if you don't have some sense for that. And so we were feeling like that was the gap we were trying to fill. And along the way, we felt that there were incredible people and stories that hadn't been popularized, that went back way further than people, I think, gave us credit for as a practice. So we wanted to make sure that came through. The other thing we wanted to highlight is, in so many of these situations, and I would ask you, Kate, if you still think this is today, despite all we know, despite all the incredible tools we have, there are still individual people making qualitative design decisions to shape many, many things. They may go through vetting, they may go through prototyping and testing. It's not like they suddenly appear on your television or, change the way you drive your car. But nonetheless, like, it is still a lot of individual decision-making. It is a lot of people in very interesting situations. And so we wanted to kind of highlight that, both because we think it's kind of interesting and compelling, and because it also makes you appreciate that the things you're seeing haven't been through like some sort of regulatory process to ensure that the button's in the right place, or that the information is structured well. Like, it is still a fairly kind of craft-oriented, bespoke thing. And that also, I think, gives us permission, as the people who are the subjects and the participants in this new world, to also not feel stupid and not necessarily question ourselves. We wanted to use the stories to give people that permission to question and to also respect that, at the end of the day, it's a challenging creative space to be in.
Such a great collection. So consumable. I find myself kind of dipping back into it, reading a chapter or two at a time, and it's very readable in that way. Kate, you and I met in 2019, I believe.
I think so, right before the world changed. Before before that.
Those years are a bit blurry, but
yeah.
At the Fortune Brainstorm Design Conference, it was in Singapore. It was an amazing conference in many ways, a real coming together of a lot of points of view about design and business at that time, and a lot of reflection on the years that had preceded the tremendous growth in the across the industry that we had seen. And your talk at that conference still resonates with me, where you were, really talking about design leadership as this emerging practice and force in the broader industry. I just wonder if you could reflect on that now and kind of give us a few of the highlights that you were bringing forward in that talk.
Yeah, it was an interesting time for me coming to GV where I wasn't just responsible for one brand. You know, if you're at one brand, you get very laser focused on that. I've got my team. I'm going to get as much talent on my team as I can, you know, focus on the daily task at hand. But once I went over to GV, I found not only was I seeing lots of, you know, purview over all of these startups, I just started to be this person that people would call when they're like, I'm looking for somebody to run my design team. Do you know anybody? So-and-so's leaving. Do you know anybody? And I started to recognize there was good and bad out there, basically, which led me to write the talk. One, there was more demand now for design leaders than there had been before. You know, we go back and forth, the supply and demand issue, right? Like one point it felt like there were too many designers, not enough demand. I was seeing the flip side. There were all these design leadership positions open that to me seemed pretty attractive, and it felt like musical chairs. You'd see the same person. There's like 15 to 20 people, and they just got to move around the table. And then they were all like amazing people that pioneered things. But it was like, hey guys, like we've got the seat at the table. This is cool. But there's a whole generation behind us that we actually have a real responsibility to help bring them up. And also to not have such a closed system. Let's create community. Like if you've got somebody great on your team that's ready to move on, call somebody and get them hired in another company. Like let's unsilo ourselves. Let's create community and let's really start mentoring the group behind us. And then there were also a few warnings in there, which I think is interesting given Robert's recent article. Also kind of saying like, look, guys, the next generation probably doesn't look like you. We were all pioneers. And when you're a pioneer, you get certain things stuck in your head. You do things a certain way. You're like, I will report to the CEO. Design must be done this way. I will only have a team that looks like this. This is what critique looks like. And we have a lot of thanks to give for folks that pioneered things. But the next generation probably doesn't look like us. They're probably more technically savvy. They're, you know, some of them code or they just come from different backgrounds. Like I didn't go to school for web design. There was no web. I didn't have email in college, right?
Yeah, they're entry points to our earlier part of the conversation, as opposed to being creative kids and art and making and creating being the entry point. I totally see that. I think technology and gaming and, you know, music and skateboarding and all sorts of different things will be the entry point, and that'll absolutely influence that path. Yeah.
So that's what spawned that. It was more of a also just I found such power once I kind of got out of my Facebook or LinkedIn or Wealthfront kind of bubble and connecting with other leaders. There was such power because it does get really lonely when you're the only person running design at a company, and there's such just power in getting together with other folks that are doing the same. And we didn't have to compete with one another. We could actually help move talent around, help further the discipline together.
That was a really resonant point that I think you were really driving home in that talk, was challenging the territorialism that had really emerged in the industry, you know, in a very short amount of time, because we're talking about single-digit numbers of years here. When most of this growth had actually happened, and all of a sudden here we were just in these little fiefdoms of design teams and programs, and we were fending off and building walls around ourselves.
Yeah. And I take full responsibility for doing that at Facebook. I mean, we were trying to suck up all the talent. We were buying design consultancies. It was a talent, you know, and I look back on that time and I might have done things a little bit differently at the time, but recognizing that if I was doing that, everyone else was doing the same thing. It was time to think a little bit differently about that.
Well, I wonder if now that talk or those ideas would sort of land, I don't know, differently.
Sorry, Robert, I'm just going to keep quoting you and not let you talk about your own article. Your newest article around design community. There's certainly, right, like I'm not the first person to wake up and say, wow, it gets lonely as a design leader. Like, let's create some real groups and community around there. But I think, candidly, I think there's some issues with that in that it's kind of, again, it's a little musical chairs. It's the same group of people continuing to get together, which is why at GV, I think for the past 5 years, we've hosted these design exec retreats where we try to bring in about 15 people that are doing great work the Katie Dills and Steve Johnsons and Greg from the New York Times. We give them a safe space to chat, but we also bring them the startup perspective. Like, you guys have these teams of hundreds. Here's what's happening on the ground with a team of two. And then we try to create communication channels between the two to try to start to join some of these folks that are big leaders, big teams doing awesome work. But here's the next group coming up. Let's not continue to have this big divide. I'm a design executive. This is my group. And you're in the startup grouping. I called some folks just before this call that are in some of our startups that are running teams and asked them, do you read these articles? Who do you think of as your community? Are you worried that design is dead? What's going on here? And they're just so focused on what's next in front of them. I mean, they're still, it's great. They're optimists. They're working on what's next. They need the help though too. Anyway, I still think we need more community, but really have it span size of company, stage of company, sector of company, experience from people. There's so much we could all be learning from each other. We're not doing enough of it.
So a couple thoughts. The first is, as a designer, design leader, someone who's been at this for a while, I always take pride in trying to place myself in rooms where there aren't a lot of designers and design trained people. And in the work I do, that's kind of my day-to-day existence. And I think it's really important. Whatever community building we do within design, and I think there is a deficit and a need for more of that, we also have to reach out and place ourselves in rooms full of people from very different backgrounds. To me, it's very important, and it goes beyond maybe just more experienced designers to less, but it's really people there are so many people that I encounter. Like these days, because of the work I do, I'm spending a lot of time with people who do community organizing. And that has a direct impact because we're doing very community-based advocacy-oriented work, particularly right now in Houston. But at the same time, there are skills of community organizing that would benefit, I think, many of the design leaders you're probably talking to and designers at startups. I mean, there is a skill set there. There's a way of understanding how you motivate people. So anyway, I did want to say that for me, that has always been kind of a beacon. And one of the reasons my story is the way it is in terms of breaking up with design a lot is trying to find those new places and communities to connect to. But I do think this question of culture building, community building, and succession is also really, it's on my mind at the stage of my career. I don't know, Doug, if it is yours. And it makes me think back to kind of this conundrum, which is I actually think when I first started working, for example, at a place like Frog, on the one hand, it's a postage stamp size company compared to Facebook. I mean, at its height, it was at the time 600-700 people. It was tiny. But there were a lot of designers there, and there was a lot of investment in building that culture, passing it on, and maintaining it. The problem is at the top were generally tyrants, people who were very controlling founders. And so there wasn't really an easy kind of succession path towards leadership beyond a certain point. But what there was a durable multi-generational culture of design. And then I think about what's happened in business and the people I know and the people I spoke to, and maybe this brings us back to the articles. Even though the scale was much bigger, there actually wasn't an easy place to build that multi-generational culture of design and what it meant. And so when I think about what it kept inspiring me when I was at a place like Frog, and even what keeps inspiring me in our current practice, it's mostly the younger people that I work with. That's what helps me see new possibilities. That's what helps me understand why I'm going out and trying to sort of create this space and communicate this value and generate buy-in, is because there are so many interesting young people with so many ideas, some design trained, and in the work I do, many not. And so, for me, that is what makes this work sort of sustainable and so exciting. And I'm asking myself, what is my succession path? Me and Ravi have spent the last 2 years rewriting all our statutes and governance and trying to figure out, how do we take this crazy, marginally profitable, difficult to run thing and make sure it's set up. And I think that it's always been ironic to me a little bit, because I think some of the organizations that built the biggest reputations as standalone design agencies, the people who ran them weren't thinking that way. They were just visionary and they created the space for it. But it was always felt like it was a little against the grain. And so I feel like that question of what is the responsibility of this generation of design leaders and how do we live up to that responsibility, to me feels very important. And coming back to the articles and where I'm trying to go with it, that is one of the underlying things. What is the responsibility? Because I think on the one hand, Kate, a lot of people did a lot of great pioneering things. I think also a lot of people had a lot of privilege. doors were open to them, not because they necessarily were fully tested. It's just they happened to be in the right network and things happened. And so I am wondering about that, both the succession idea as well as kind of the responsibility to grow and diversify the profession.
Well, Kate, I wonder if you're seeing any sort of encouraging, formalization of succession planning or how leaders that you're working with, is this call to action landing with them? And are they behaving differently? Are they working differently? And do you see any of those tangible signals?
It's a good question. I would say succession planning comes up more and more. Maybe it's just because the age of the folks that I'm hanging out with, we are talking about it a little bit more. But I do think that people are more cognizant of how they plan to leave organizations, and are they building a stronger bench, a stronger leadership team, not only for themselves, but unlike maybe folks that wanted to build an agency after themselves. These folks also just want a great leadership team underneath. They want new perspective. They want to share some of the burden of what's going on. So, and I do see a lot more open connection and chatting amongst folks, like, who are the up and coming people I should meet? What's going on? Please help me meet the next generation. Do you have somebody good? I love your I love what you're doing. I love your culture. Please make some introductions. So just from my little purview of some of the WhatsApp threads I'm on and other things like that, I do see a lot more openness and sharing and willingness of folks to really help each other do it. I don't know. We'd have to look in the organization, see if it's happening any better. For example, there are still people hiring heads of design. I just spoke yesterday, YouTube is looking for somebody right now. Chris Jaffe left, who did a terrific job here, and they're looking for a new head of design. So, there are still folks looking for these pretty big roles. They're still out there.
That's all for this episode of This is a Prototype, the Design Leadership Podcast. Remember, part 2 of my discussion with Kate Aronowitz and Robert Fabricant will post next week. Special thanks to Scott Leach of Brandspeak Communications for his production assistance and to Graham Barton for his original theme music. I'd love for you to help me grow the audience for this podcast by liking and following it on your favorite podcast platform. And I'd also love your help finding great design leaders for future episodes of the show. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn with your ideas. You can find out more about my work as a design leader on my website, dougpowell.design. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.